So in this video, I'm going to go over local users and groups. And I say local because the users are stored on the machine, not in any kind of central authentication server such as IPA or IDM. If you make the same user on two different systems, right, they're going to have different UIDs, different files, different permissions to those files. For instance, if I have server 1 and I create Bob, and I have server 2 and I create Bob, any files I make on server 1 inside Bob's home directory aren't going to be in Bob's home directory on server 2 because in essence they're two different users on two different systems. But if you use the central authentication service, like it's sort of like Active Directory, right? Then that user would be one user that could log into both machines. So when we think about what a user is on a system, right, it's really just a security boundary made up of different pieces that are spread across a bunch of different files like etc password or etc shadow, and those pieces put together they make up a user which we can then use to separate our files and our permissions. We have a username, right, which makes it easy to identify a user, for us humans, but each username gets a user ID, a UID, which the system uses. Every process is run as a user, and every file has a user that owns that file. There's three types of users. We've got super users, which have administrative rights, right? Like root, you can see I'm root right now. They have a UID of 0, so if I do an ID, I see root has a UID of 0, group ID 0, group 0. I can do anything I want on the system. That's a super user. Then there's like system users, right? Which are processes they're used by processes, sometimes called daemons, right? And they're generally non-privileged, and they only have access to the files that they need in order to run their processes. And then we have regular user accounts for everyday use, like system users. So if I go into my etc password here, right, I have, these are all my different users. There's the super user, root. We've got system users, right? ADM, LP, sync, games, FTP, nobody, systemd, right? And then down here, I've created, there's three users that are created, regular users, EC2, Titus, and Wizard. So like I said, if I wanted to know, some of the properties of the current user I'm at, right, I would just do an ID. If I wanted to know the properties of another user that's not me, I just do an ID Titus, assuming I have the permissions, right? And it's going to tell me my UID, my group ID, and my groups. If I do an ls-l, right, for a file, right? So let's create a file here, file 1. If I do an ls-l on file 1, I can see who the owner is, right? Root is the owner, and who the group owner is, and then that's root. So anybody in the group is going to have permissions to this folder, to this file as well. And these are the permissions that this user or anybody in this group has to this file. They can read and write as a user, they can read as a group, and we'll go over other as well later. And earlier I mentioned users are really just security boundaries spread across multiple files. And I've shown you that etc password file already, but if we go back into it, right, etc password, there's different items here, right? I have the user, the X is going to be the password, but it's not stored here. That's stored in etc shadow. My user ID, my group ID, the real name of the user, right? So if I go down here and I look at Titus the Third, I've given him the real name Titus the Third because if I created a user called Wizard, right, that's obviously not someone's real name. I want to know who's actually using the account Wizard. So if you had a weird naming convention in your organization, like first initial dot last name, you would add the real name so you would know who owns that account within your organization. Then we have the user's home directory, and then we have the default shell that they're going to get put into when they log in. And like I said, the X here it's the password, but it's not stored here. It's stored in etc shadow. So if we go to vi etc shadow, right? These are my users, and these are their encrypted passwords. There's hashes in there, salts. So multiple people can have the same password, but by throwing the salt in there, that's what allows that to be possible. So now we've gone over users. Let's kind of go over groups, right? And they're the same as users, right? It's a way to easily identify a group of users on your system using a group name, which is mapped to a group ID. And you might want to use groups to give multiple users the same permissions, right? You might have an admins group, you might have a web developers group, and by putting these users in those groups, you don't have to go to 10 of your web admins and configure their permissions individually. You can just put them in the web admins group, and then assuming you've properly configured web admins group, they would have access to everything they needed to. And groups are stored. Group information can be found in etc group, and apparently I have a permission denied here. Let's see. Oh, you know what? Because it's a file, not a directory. Okay. So these are my different groups, right? I've got a root group, I've got a password here, group password. Those are no longer used, so that should always be X. And then the group ID. And a user is always going to have one primary group, right? So if I do an ID on Titus here, my primary group is Titus. The primary group for every user is always going to be the same username as that user. And then we have supplementary groups, right, that we can add that user to. So a user can be a member of its primary group, but it can also be a member of maybe a web admins group or the wheel group for sudo permissions. And that means it would have access to it would have the permissions of every group that it's in, right? And I think that's it for this video. I'll see you next time.